Consider this image. The photo was taken on June 5th, 1989, during a several-month period of massive student and citizen protests in Beijing, China. Demonstrators, around 1 million according to British sources, were calling for reforms, increasing democracy, free speech, and freedom of the press. In response, the government sent in the military, including thousands of heavily armed soldiers, who at various points opened fire on the crowd, killing upwards of 10,000 people. 30 years later, the identity of this man standing in front of the tanks is still unclear, as well as what became of him. But this image remains an iconic symbol of what are now referred to as the protests or the massacre of Tiananmen Square. Maybe even more poignant is the seconds-long video that surfaced of the incident. What comes up for you as you contemplate this scene? Do you wonder at the bravery of the man? The unbelievable power a military can yield against its people? Or maybe what happened next for the man and for the country in general? As a sociologist, what comes up for me is the questions we can ask and lessons we can learn from these events about power. Who has power and how do they get it? How can power be yielded for or against a people? And how even a single individual can have incredible power even against tremendous odds. These and other questions about power are foundational to sociology and will be foundational to this course. So let's transition a bit and dive more directly into course material. In this video, we'll shine a light on the concept of power. We'll get a bit granular to explore what it is and how it works, so that ultimately we can understand how to better recognize it out in the world and even harness it in our own lives. There are debates in sociology about how to best define power because the concept is complex, but one popular definition boils power down to this: the ability to achieve desired ends despite resistance from others. In other words, the ability to do or get what you want even if others don't want the same thing or outcome. There are also debates about how power works, what forms it takes, and how we can access and use it. To simplify things, we're amalgamating different typologies of power that have emerged in the field of sociology from the early 1900s to the present. This is definitely not required, but if you're like me and you like to nerd out on these things, feel free to check out my sources. You can find them in the references for this video in Slate. For everyone else, just keep watching. So in this amalgamated version, there are 5 forms of power. Let's kick off the first one with some photos. Here we have a thief, a schoolyard bully, and the US military. All of these have power for the same reasons. Can you see what they have in common? They all have access to physical force or threat to get what they want. This thief can get your money even if you don't want to hand it over because of his weapon. The schoolyard bully can use his size to bully others out of their lunch money or steal their homework or whatever else he might want. A military force can get access to the natural resources of an occupied territory despite the protests of local people because of the threat of violence or actual violence their weapons can impose. The next form of power is also fairly easy to identify. Can you make it out from the pictures? The customers on this rickshaw and the owners of this apartment got the rickshaw driver and the domestic cleaners to do work they didn't want to do themselves on their behalf. How? Of course, they just paid them. So let's add wealth to our list of forms of power. As you know, money can get people to do all kinds of things they'd rather not, from going to their boring office job or thanklessly flipping burgers, to even selling their own organs to rich countries for transplants. Have you heard of this? For more info on the illegal organ trade or what's called transplant tourism, check the description below. This brings us to our third form of power. The photo shows schoolgirls whispering. Let's assume they're spreading rumors about the third girl. Even though this is a relatively small-scale scenario, you can probably remember from your own middle or high school experience the damage that rumors can do, even if they aren't true. If the girls spreading the rumors have prestige or status at the school, their version of the truth is likely to be the one that everyone believes. So prestige is incredibly powerful because it usually goes hand in hand with influence. In other words, the power to be listened to, followed, and believed. People might have prestige and influence at a local level, like popular kids at their school, or they can have an even wider influence across a city or country or even globally, like we'll talk about next. Of course, we can't talk about influence in the age of the internet without talking about social media. Can you guess who some of the top social media influencers have been over the past few decades, according to number of followers? Numbers fluctuate from one year to the next, but generally the people with the largest following around the globe are, you probably won't be surprised to know, singer-performers, rappers, reality stars, actors, and celebrity chefs. But maybe you didn't know that the people with the most followers are often soccer players. And we can't forget internet personalities like Zach King, Jay Alvarez, and Canadian Lily Singh, who became famous through social media itself. With so many followers and continual access to their followers through social media, these people can have incredible impact on the world, for good or evil. This is why they're often approached by government officials to promote things like COVID vaccines or voting among youth, or approached by corporations for sponsorships because they have such a big influence on what people buy. The fourth kind of power on our list is a power that's bound up in complex ways with our social systems. This is authority. What comes to mind when you think of authority figures? Some typical examples are teachers, judges, and politicians. What's unique about authority figures in our list so far is where they get their power. Typically, an authority figure's power is tied to their job or position in society. And this is important to remember. That power is backed up by an institution. So a teacher has the power to give a bad grade or even fail students because they're part of a larger education system that records and implements those decisions. If a student fails grade 5, they can't just show up the next year for grade 6, even if the teacher who failed them is no longer at that school. A judge can send someone to jail not only because they found that person guilty of a crime, but because there is a whole criminal justice system in place to back them up. This is why, on the one hand, someone with authority can have an enormous amount of power within an institution, but maybe limited power outside of it. If a teacher tells a random kid on the street to go work on some math equations, or a judge tells a random shopper in a mall to go to jail, it likely wouldn't work. It's also why some people have trouble with authority figures and rebel. They might think, I don't respect this person as an individual, so why would I listen to them just because they're in this authority position? Of course, this depends on how powerful the system is, or how dire the consequences are of rebelling. It's usually a lot easier to tell your high school teacher to F off than a police officer, who has the power of physical threat on top of authority on their side. This may be painful for some of us to think about because of the incalculable harm and fear that's come out of some of these systems. We'll talk more about inequalities and abuses of power later in the course. The fifth and last form of power we'll talk about is informational and ideological power. This is the power over how information is distributed, what is able to be known, and what is seen as true. One clear example of the misuse of informational power is when governments, rulers, or elites limit freedom of the press or freedom of information. There are countless examples of this currently and throughout history, including jailing journalists, censoring what can be published, creating fake news, or more recently, limiting internet access. Another type of abuse of informational power is when certain groups are prevented from accessing education or even basic literacy, thereby giving other groups more power. Here's a photo of the University of Toronto's graduating medical school class in 1905. As you can see, there was limited access to women, people of color, and probably the working classes. Ideological power is similar, but a bit more subtle and maybe abstract. I use the term ideological power here to mean power over what others think, or power over what others see as true. People have ideological power when they are trusted as bearers of fact, knowledge, or truth. Does anyone come to mind for you in this category? Think about that for a second. Who do you trust when you're looking for facts, knowledge, or truth? What sources help you learn or decide what to do about things like COVID, or where to go to college, or how to be fit and healthy, or even why the sky is blue? You can go even deeper and ask yourself, where did you learn about where to get trustworthy information in the first place? Maybe even when you were very young. In North American culture, if you're part of a dominant group, you're likely to trust people in positions of authority or prestige, like so-called experts, scientists and researchers, journalists, political leaders, and educators. Those of us in non-dominant groups are less likely to trust mainstream authority figures and may look instead to social movement, community, and spiritual leaders, elders, friends, and family members. Speaking of which, how much do you trust what I'm saying right now? This video might have more or less ideological power with you. You may be skeptical or trusting or somewhere in between. One of the goals of this class is actually to reduce the informational and ideological power of the instructor and the college. Using an educational philosophy called critical pedagogy, our aim is to give you more power over what and how you learn. So don't take what I say for granted. You always have the option of increasing your own informational and ideological power by asking questions, bringing in your own experience, expertise, and knowledge, and checking out where any of the information presented comes from. We'll keep coming back to this as we move through the course. We just went over 5 different forms of power. Let's take a second to review. Usually this helps with learning. Can you remember a few of them? We'll give you about 30 seconds of music to think. If you want longer than that, or if you'd rather think without music, just hit the pause button. How'd you do? Here are the answers one at a time. Now that we have a full list, what do we do with it? Well, for one thing, where do you see yourself in this picture? We all have access to certain kinds of power more than others, and this changes depending on the situation. Which forms of power do you have more access to? Which do you have less access to? In which contexts? Are there areas of your life where you want more power? How could you get it? And the million-dollar question, what would you do with that power? Going back to our definition of power, what are your desired ends, your goals? To answer these questions, it might be helpful to say one more thing about power. Unless there are mechanisms to prevent this, power tends to get concentrated in the hands of a small number of people and groups. This is partly because having some forms of power gives you better access to other forms. Can you see how? Take a moment to think about that. Here are some ideas, but you might have others. With wealth, you can buy access to physical force by hiring bodyguards or buying weapons. Money also gives you access to influence, since you can buy advertising or celebrity endorsements. Having influence or prestige Or physical power can also give you better access to wealth, and on and on. This tendency of power to concentrate into the hands of only a few people or groups brings up a whole list of questions related to what kind of society we want to live in. For example, should we disperse power or should we let it conglomerate? How much should we spread it out? Should people earn their way to power, or is a certain amount of power a human right? One of the main ideas of democracy, or even more egalitarian systems, is that they have mechanisms to disperse power. This can be at the large scale of political systems, to the medium scale of organizations or companies, or even at the small scale of a family or friendship group. Bringing this back to you again, how much power do you want in different areas of your life? How much power do you feel you have the right to? Would you want power to be differently distributed in your family? What about at your workplace? What about in the government or in society in general? These are tough questions that usually take a while to answer. So no rush, there's lots of time to let them marinate as we make our way through the semester together. Before we wrap up, here's a quick summary of what we covered in this video. We looked at what power is and how it's generally defined in sociology. We then explored how power works by going over 5 different forms that power can take. Finally, we noted that power tends to concentrate, and that having some forms of power gives us access to other forms more easily. We also left you with some questions to consider about power, how you see the concepts applying to your own life and goals, and how you think power should be distributed in a society more generally. Now that you have some concepts in your toolbox, let's go back to where we started, the protests of Tiananmen Square. You might have a bit of a different lens on the situation. Here are some questions to consider. Number 1. As far as you can tell, what were some of the motivations for the protests? Do you see any connection to concepts in this video? Feel free to look more into the event than what the video covers if you're interested. 2. As far as you can tell, how powerful were different parties during the protests? Going back to our definition of power, how well were they able to meet desired ends despite resistance from others? What forms of power did they use? Number 3, what comes up for you in response to this event? Did anything surprise you, leave you hopeful, angry, confused, or something else? Does the event leave you with any thoughts or questions about power, how it should or shouldn't be distributed, or who should have more or less of it? If you're not sure about some of this, that's totally fine. Sometimes these things take time to sink in. You can always come back later. And make sure to check Slate for any further instructions from your instructor. This brings our mini lesson on power to a close. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.
Alright.